We're very privileged this afternoon to have with us Dr. Hazel Smith. She's one of the people outside North Korea who knows most about North Korea. So we're very lucky to have her with us. Dr. Smith is with SOAS in London, but are you in London now?
I'm in Sheffield in the north of England. We call it God's own county, because, a bit like the Texans think about Texas.
Very good, excellent. We've had UK participation before, but it's nice to have Atlantic ties as well as Pacific ties. Let me tell the audience now that we will take questions and answers toward the end, so please use the Q&A function on the Zoom app at the bottom of the screen, and you can start writing questions whenever you like, and we'll turn to those when we finish up. There's a lot we could talk about. I'd like to focus on your May 12th article in Critical Asian Studies, title of which was The Ethics of United Nations Sanctions on North Korea, Effectiveness, Necessity, and Proportionality. So I'll ask you to summarize your argument, but before that, for context, I wanted to point out that economic sanctions have been with us for a very long time. In 1935, the League of Nations imposed sanctions on Italy over its invasion of Ethiopia. And in my youth, sanctions against South Africa were a hot topic. It wasn't that apartheid was controversial, we were all against it, but the question was whether the sanctions on South Africa were hurting Black South Africans more than they're undermining apartheid. So these issues have been with us for some time. So as a general proposition, first, are economic sanctions ever ethical?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the KEI for inviting me, and thank you for giving up your time for anybody that's zooming in today. I really appreciate it. And I think you're right, absolutely right, Mark. Sanctions, economic sanctions, go back a very, very long time. I mean, 2,500 years ago, Thucydides, when writing about the Peloponnesian War, talked about the Megarian decree when Athens imposed sanctions on Megaria, one of Sparta's allies, and this is sometimes seen as one of the Sparks' economic sanctions, stop them going in the marketplaces and trading in the seas. And this is seen as one of the sparks of this very brutal war, which ended Athenian dominance. So you're right; they go back an awful long time. And as to the justice of and justifiability of sanctions, discussion and philosophizing has gone on about the justice of how you treat innocents, basically, in conflict, also for a long time. All the major philosophical and religious traditions have talked about this. So the good thing is that we don't have to just rely on personal opinion when we're talking about the ethics of war or the ethics of conflict. It's almost easier when we're talking about war because we've got this quite long-standing just war, tradition of just war for us to think about whether wars are ethical. And I want to mention that because I want to contrast this just war tradition in the fact that it's legalized in the Geneva Conventions with the fact that we have nothing analogous in any similar conventions or law in terms of how innocents can be treated in conflict where military force is not being used. It's quite amazing that, to me, really, and I think it's not very well known that we don't have analogous conventions for thinking about how innocents can be treated in peacetime. So what often happens is that the ethics of sanctions are treated as an analogy to just war. And I just say briefly that means that you think about, is there a just cause? Is it a right cause? And are the means that you use just? And and there are three very traditional criteria by which one looks at means. One is effectiveness, one is necessity, one is proportionality. So the long answer to your question is it rather depends on what you find out once you've been through that framework.
Okay, I think governments reach for sanctions because they're a tool short of war. So often there's a pressure on governments to do something about a situation, and not wanting to go to war, sanctions seem like a peaceful means of trying to apply some coercion. So they're all over the place. At this point, I saw a listing that showed that some 40 countries are under economic sanctions of one form or other. So they're convenient. There are people who argue that they cannot be effective, but I'm not sure about that. I mean, I know in 1992, the US and the EU imposed sanctions on Serbia, and they cut the Serbian GDP in half quite quickly. But then what followed from that was the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So the sanctions seemed to have been effective, but they didn't have the desired outcome. You know, something else happened. So to turn to North Korea then, it's good to talk about something other than whether sanctions are working or how hard they're biting. I think it's healthy to talk about whether they're a good idea, whether they're ethical or not. So can I ask you to summarize your argument regarding North Korea?
Thank you very much. And I wonder if you could just give me a bit of leeway to talk a few minutes about that, because there is a logic to this argument. It's not just a set of personal opinions. And
no, please do.
If I take a bit longer now, I will briefer on the other bits.
We want to hear this.
Okay, thank you for your patience. First of all, a bit of scene setting. I think one of the things to think about is that economic sanctions are sometimes used as a complement to military force. But I'm going to talk about economic sanctions in the way you talked about them, which is when they're used instead of military force, when they're intended to get to a political outcome without having to go to war. The other issue is success. Now, we can say that we can look at success in all sorts of different ways. Were they partially successful? Did they signal something? But I think that means that anything can be successful or anything can be a failure in analytical terms. So what I've done in this piece, and I think what quite a lot of people do when they're thinking about economic sanctions, is are the declared aims achieved? That's the way I'm looking at sanctions. And I think it's worthwhile saying that if you look at even the most conservative political science and comparative politics and historical literature, or all of the literature, it's very, very hard to find in the empirical literature or the theoretical literature, any of it, evidence that sanctions are successful in those terms, unless they're accompanied by diplomacy, for example. But on their own, and I'm happy to send out people book lists on this, there's simply not the evidence that they are successful. Again, perhaps surprising. There's been a lot of work done on this area. And Serbia, I think, is a very good example, because the aim of the sanctions wasn't to strangle Serbia economically per se, but it was to bring an end to the violence in the Balkans. And so you still had, in the end, NATO military activity around Sarajevo, you had active diplomacy in Dayton, and then you had the bombing of Belgrade even later on when we went into the Kosovo war. And it's very, very difficult to argue that today in Kosovo and in Bosnia-Herzegovina, we've got a very productive outcome as well. So I think that's a very, very good example of the problems in thinking about whether sanctions on their own achieve ends. So what did I find when I started looking at this framework in terms of United Nations sanctions on North Korea? Well, I think in terms of, was the cause just? Was it right? Was it right to go to use economic sanctions? I think others might disagree that there's no contest that North Korea was acting illegally, especially after the first 2006 resolution in the development of the nuclear and missile program, and irrespective of the fact there was some mission creep in the UN resolutions. Nevertheless, it's difficult to I think, argue that there was not a just cause. And that's why this article doesn't, there might be room for a debate on this, but I take it as read that there's a strong argument that there was a legal and normative consensus, there was a just cause in terms of the sanctions. But the issue for me, once I started to look at it, was, are the means ethically supportable through these three criteria of effectiveness, necessity, and proportionality? And these are the standard criteria, I didn't invent them, that people have used over a very long time. And effectiveness isn't just about looking back. I mean, we can look back 14 years and say the UN didn't achieve denuclearization through sanctions, therefore they weren't effective. And that's true, I mean, there's obvious. But in ethical reasoning terms, this is an anticipatory criterion. And so the argument is, could looking at the situation in 2006 and then later in 2016, when the sanctions regime was changed, could an assessment have been made about the likely impact of the likely success of the measures? Now, arguably it could have been done, but the issue, and maybe again people may not know this, it was never done. There was never, ever, and still hasn't been, an impact assessment either in terms of effectiveness or potential effectiveness of the sanctions. So difficult to see that the effectiveness criteria is fulfilled. The second criteria were economic sanctions necessary. And again, this is jargon in some sense, but it's part of the normal ethical criteria. All it means is that when you use economic sanctions, they should really be a last resort. And in practical terms, in international affairs, this means, has diplomacy been used to try to effect the political change you want to? Now, in my work, I don't concentrate on this because I think the jury's still out as to whether sustained diplomacy was either entertained or implemented with the DPRK. And the reason that I mention this is that because diplomacy normally is about process. It's about a process of negotiation to get where you want to get to. But the UN resolutions stipulated the process or the absence of it, as well as the endpoint. So the process was complete, irreversible and verifiable disarmament prior to negotiations. And that's a very, very odd way to do diplomacy. And diplomacy at its heart is about negotiating with actors whose values you don't share. It's not about negotiating. It's not about negotiating with friends. So let's say the jury's out on this. And again, I think there can be an empirical debate as to whether there was sustained diplomacy. The UN outsourced diplomacy, which it doesn't always do, but it did in this case to the United States. So there's a big discussion about that. But I think what I was really started to find was that there were big, big problems about the issue of proportionality, particularly if we start looking at the two phases of UN sanctions on North Korea. The first phase, from 2000 to 2016, was very, very different and got hardly any publicity when it was changed under the Obama administration. Between 2006 and 16, UN sanctions were targeted against individuals, institutions, and commodities directly tied to the nuclear program. And I think in this period, there is a reasonable argument for proportionality, although there were very, very tough enforcement of dual use sanctions. But when you start to look at the post-2016 period, because sanctions no longer differentiated between the civilian and the military economy, then I think we start to see a very, very different picture. And I don't think that that's been properly discussed. Again, for those of you that don't look at this all the time, what happened in 2016 was that all the DPRKs, North Korea's major exports, were banned. Practically all imports were banned, either directly or as potentially dual-use goods, and that included everything to do with agriculture. In 2017, and these are the major sanctions that I talk about in my work, energy sanctions were introduced that banned all imports of natural gas, the only time this has ever been done in a sanctions resolution in the UN ever, to North Korea, and very sharply limited oil imports, so that North Korea was already the second lowest importer of oil in the world, is now absolutely the lowest. Now, what does this mean for food? And that's the thing that I've been working on for quite a long time in North Korea. All modern agriculture, including in North Korea, including in the United States, including in the UK, including in poor countries, relies on oil inputs, for pesticide production, for fertilizer production, for fuel for agricultural machinery, for irrigation, for transport of food and inputs, all of it, everywhere in the world. And although in North Korea, farming production does rely on manual labor, there's not much technology even today, especially today maybe, still oil you can't substitute oil in everything. And North Korea has no indigenous oil resources. It's not like Iran, which is sanctioned, or Russia, which is sanctioned, where they've got indigenous oil. So here is where I started looking at the impact of these sanctions, these latest sanctions, on the farming sector. And we've got lots and lots of good research on this, and I'm happy to, on the issue of energy and farming, and I'm happy to send any of that to anybody after this. So what does this absence of oil inputs, what mean for food production if you can't produce fertilizer or pesticide or import oil for fuel to transport food and inputs for your agriculture, which feeds 25 million people? And that's the thing. In North Korea, it's not the government that gets harmed by agricultural supply problems. It's the people who rely, 25 million people, most of them rely on the domestic farming sector. And that's for basic food to keep them alive. Again, we're talking about 1,700 calories a day is what the food production is supposed to bring. So what were the findings? So up till 2017, and again, people may not be aware of this, the North Korean farming sector had been rebuilt so that it required a very achievable 500,000 tons of grain imports a year. And it produced in total about 5 million tons for 25 million people. That was okay, it was sufficient for about 10 years. But after 2017, with the implementation of the oil and energy sanctions, in 2018, in the harvest, the import requirement shot up to 1.5 million tons. And that was because farm production collapsed in 2018 after the implementation of oil and energy sanctions. And we know that it was because of oil and energy sanctions because the area planted did not change very much, but yields plummeted. Now, falling yields, as the Food and Agriculture Organization points out, were a direct result of this precipitous fall in oil and natural gas imports. If you haven't got fertilizer and pesticides and other agricultural inputs, your yields go down. Now, again, the UN never did an impact analysis of sanctions on the civilian sector, but we've got plenty of information about the relative consumption of oil in the different sectors, economic sectors in North Korea, again, to know where these sanctions would have hit. So the agricultural production plummeted in 2018. Now, that meant that in 2019, there wasn't enough food to feed people, 8 million people of the 25 million population, at basic ration levels. Now, if we compare, to bring the ethical issues back in, under the Geneva Conventions, in wartime, it's an explicit war crime to destroy food production. It's an explicit war crime. And this is because usually domestic food availability, if you don't have domestic food availability, its loss falls the hardest on children, the sick, the elderly, those that are out of favour with the regime, with people with contacts who can perhaps get food from abroad. So in terms of proportionality, even the most conservative understandings of proportionality, it's very, very hard to assess energy and oil sanctions and the sanctions which prohibited agricultural equipment coming in, which were directly focused on the civilian sector, because the military sector by and large is covered by other sanctions, as anything other than disproportionate. And if we look at those three criteria, and then they're not mutually exclusive, and we find that there was vast disproportionality in terms of the effect on innocents, non-combatants, children, elderly, people who can't cope for themselves, it's very, very hard to argue that the ethical criteria through which all the major cultural traditions judge economic sanctions, that they were fulfilled. One of the obvious questions, I'm going to finish here because you have given me a lot of leeway, thank you, is why wasn't there a humanitarian disaster in 2019 and again this year? And it looks like, and from what I can tell, that China gave 1 million tons of food aid, which is an enormous amount. It's as much as the World Food Programme was giving in the famine at its most in 2019, and probably is, well, we know 600,000 tons, probably 1 million tons again this year. So the argument isn't that at this moment, North Koreans are facing a humanitarian disaster. They're not, because China's helping them. But the argument is that farming has been destroyed because of directly because of UN sanctions. And is that something that we would want to support? Because it means that people can't feed themselves in the future as well as now. And politically, of course, it pushes North Korea directly and makes them much more of a client state of China than they ever were before. So that's it. You have given me a lot of leeway. Thank you very much indeed.
It's a very succinct presentation of some very complex ideas. So, no, well done. Let me ask three kind of quick questions, and then we'll try to get to the audience. First, let's go back to the 2006 sanctions. They were designed to slow down the North Korean or prevent their nuclear weapons program. And there has been some analysis that shows that the surprise about North Korea is not that they developed nuclear weapons. The surprise is how long it took them. So it could be argued that the 2006 sanctions actually did slow down the program, and that was useful. So in that sense, were those sanctions justified or ethical?
I think I'd like to distinguish between an argument and an opinion. One can have an opinion and say that these sanctions, although it wasn't the objective of sanctions was not to slow down, it was to end denuclearization, and that was the objective in the UN resolutions. So I think there's just as much an argument to say it slowed down the production of North Korea's nuclear weapons as there is to say that the Geneva Agreement between 1994 and 2002, when no sanctions were used by the UN at all, slowed down North Korean nuclear development because there was no missile testing. And of course, it ended all in tears in 2002, 2003. But it's the same sort of argument. It's an opinion, but it's not. It's very, it can't be justified in any real schematic terms. Also, in terms of ethics, though, I think you can argue there's a just cause, and the means were reasonably just. I think the targeting means. So this isn't an argument that I would, if we were talking about ethics of those particular period, I think there is an argument that can be made that there's some ethical support for that period. But also in practical terms, I've been talking to some engineers that work on nuclear issues, and they tell me that it's not a short time at all in which North Korea has developed these nuclear weapons. And they say if you look at all the big states that developed nuclear weapons with all their vast resources behind them, it took quite a long time. This is not a naive achievement of the North Koreans, if we can call it achievement, because that sounds positive. And actually, it was going on. It was not a long time. It was a fairly short time in terms of the relative development of the nuclear program. But again, I think the main argument that you're getting at is that, can we see this as success or not in terms of the UN resolutions? I don't think.
Okay. Then, in terms of effectiveness as opposed to proportionality, could one make the case that the 2018 summitry between Kim Jong-un and President Trump, Moon Jae-in, was the result of the post-2016 sanctions?
I don't think so. If we look back, President Moon's diplomacy in late 2017, President Moon from South Korea, leading up to and including at the Winter Olympics, really was the prime mover behind the summits. It was wonderful diplomacy, a case study in really how to work with allies. And President Trump had been saying right from during his election campaign that he could do a deal with Kim Jong-un and was prepared to meet him. So I think the conditions are in place. Also empirically, the first summit in 2018 took place in February. And this was the oil sanctions, the big oil sanctions were in September and then in December 17. So there hadn't been time for them to work through in terms of the effect on agriculture, although all the sanctions were harmful, but not as much, not as in terms of the qualitative difference that I've talked about in terms of the effect on agriculture. And secondly, in terms of the second summit in Hanoi, the North Koreans were really concerned about sanctions then. They were going around talking to people at the summit off the record about how they could get aid, and that they were desperate at that time. But at that time also, especially just after the Hanoi failure, this is when China stepped in. And so there was no need for them to be desperate in terms of actually feeding the population. Okay, the farming sector was being destroyed, production was being destroyed, but they were no longer desperate. So for me, empirically, in terms of the setup of those summits, it was down to South Korean diplomacy. Of course, it could be argued in different ways, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Okay, my last question is about food production. So I accept the World Food Program, FAO, conclusion that there are at least 10 million malnourished North Koreans. And the World Food Program says that sanctions did harm North Korean agricultural production. But the World Food Program also says that the biggest cause of the decrease in productivity was natural causes, high temperatures, droughts, floods. Those are more important than sanctions in reducing the North Korean harvests. So is there a food security problem in North Korea that goes beyond sanctions? And how do we address that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I worked in North Korea with the UN World Food Programme and UNICEF for a couple of years at the height of the programme. And so I was involved in lots of report producing and in lots of discussions in UNICEF and World Food Programme. The way the UN works is that it's a member state organisation, and no reports can come out of the UN if they work in a country unless its partner government, not just in North Korea, agrees to the wording. The North Korean government, from when the organisations went in, would not allow any UN organisation or any NGO to put forward an analysis which suggested that there was anything other than natural disasters which was the causation of their problems. And the reason for this was because they didn't want to admit to the outside world that the economic infrastructure was structurally extremely weak and fragile. And it remains the same today, both in terms of what they will let the UN do and in terms of its not wanting to expose their weaknesses. I've read a lot of these UN reports, and I'd have to look at the wording, but mostly what the UN agronomists and the officers do is they try to avoid completely going along with saying that it's all down to natural disasters, but make some caveats to bring in the idea that perhaps there could be more efficiency and a change of the economic structure. So that is not surprising. The other thing is, for those you often see a lot of political scientists commenting on the agricultural data. Well, maybe the North Koreans have got something in it, that agriculture, you know, in North Korea is very special, and that it's specially incompetent or specially unsuited. It's completely not true. Agriculture is intrinsically everywhere in the world about the weather. Now, I don't know if anybody listening into this broadcast comes from any of the farming areas in the United States. And you will know, you'll have a smile and you'll say, well, we have bad weather. We have storms, we have typhoons, we have sandstorms. How come the United States agricultural sector is so productive? It's not because it doesn't have bad weather, it's because it has fertilizers and pesticides and natural gas and decent agricultural organization and fuel and efficient storage mechanisms and machinery. And that's the same everywhere in the world. Agriculture is about managing weather. And the obvious example is that North Korea doesn't have a weather pattern which is only available to that little bit of the northern peninsula, has similar weather in the south and in China, and their yields are not the same as in North Korea. So agriculture is about managing weather. And in fact, they were so successful up until the recent sanctions that the Internal Food and Agriculture Organization reports in 2015 were predicting that North Korea was on target to be a rice surplus country by 2030, in the same way that Vietnam has become a rice surplus country. So this is not a current country which has an inherent food security problem. And we also know that from the nutrition statistics. UNICEF's nutrition statistics, which stop in 2017 because that's when nobody can start to get in to do anything serious, show that the nutritional status of children is better on average than most of the poor countries of Asia, and better than India, for example. So again, agricultural nutrition, we've got lots and lots of data on. We don't have data on other stuff, which is pretty good, but it's good on that. And I'm happy to send it to everybody. It's all public. But I think that that's a bit of a red herring, and it's for very real reasons. It's not because it's for very, very real reasons that this comes out in discussion.
Okay. If you're available, we might have you come back and just talk about agriculture in North Korea. That's a very interesting and separate topic. Okay, I think we may run a little bit over time, but this is a good discussion, so I don't mind. Before we turn to the audience, I believe we have Ambassador Martin Uden with us. Ambassador Uden was the British ambassador in Seoul from 2008 to 11, and he went on to head the UN panel of experts on sanctions against North Korea from 2012 to 2014. So, Ambassador Uden, if you're there, please turn your camera on.
Well, I've just turned my microphone on. That's a good start anyway.
I can hear you very well.
Okay, let's keep it at that. Let's not make...
Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Now we just lost your voice.
Oh, there we go.
Now you're back. There
we are. Now I'm back. All right, I'll carry on. Hazel and Mark, great to see you. I thought that was a fascinating discussion, really was. It's rather self-serving, but it's no surprise to find that I agree with Hazel that pre-2016, there was a very different set of sanctions and frankly, a more ethical set of sanctions than we've seen since 2016. The real problem I had with the post-2016 slew of sanctions was, if you like, the ordering of them. That the UN threw everything, kitchen sink included, at the problem, exerted that maximum pressure before the diplomatic process started. To my mind, you should at least try to do it the other way around. Get some talks going, and by all means, possibly with the threat of enhanced sanctions, but doing it that way around, sanctions first, then diplomacy, you are, as it were, doomed to have that set of sanctions on the UN rulebook, as it were, forevermore. And that's the problem I see now. So Hazel, the question is, first of all, would there have been a difference in the ethical approach that you can see if you had actually reordered the sanctions, actually got that President Moon's process of diplomacy going before you put more sanctions in? But also that other question of, well, how do we get out of this mess now?
I think two things there. Thank you, Martin, as well. And I don't, you've been worked so hard on Korea over these long years, so I really, really value your questions. I think in terms of the ethical criteria of necessity, if there had been a bit more sustained diplomacy, you could easily argue that sanctions were the only thing that could be done. I think that, and so they were necessitous. I don't think that's an argument that could really be made substantially now, but it still gets over, it still raises the problem, even if you have more sustained diplomacy, of the issue of proportionality. And again, if we use the analogy of the Geneva Conventions, that it's simply a war crime to destroy farm production, which is the direct result of post-2017 UN sanctions. And it seems to me that there is a simple way out of it, that rather than abandoning all sanctions, in the process of discussion, the UN could have an impact assessment, which is never ever done on sanctions. And actually, it's false to think that we don't have enough information and data to be able to make a decent impact assessment, not on every area, but on some areas. And also to think about, well, let's suspend these sanctions, which we know are having these effects. The UN agencies themselves are saying they're having this effect. And then think about where we go from here. It's not an argument necessarily of saying, get rid of all sanctions, but you know, these ones are very, very hard to justify.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Uden. Running out of time, what I'm going to do is kind of do a rapid fire round for you. I usually like to give the names of people who send questions in, but I'm going to do violence to them by making them short. So I'm going to leave their names out so I don't mischaracterize them too much. So the first question is, sanctions weren't a form of warfare, they were a way to prevent warfare. So when the North Korea was developing nuclear weapons in violation of UN resolutions, and because of its atrocious human rights record, what should the UN have done, if not sanctions?
Yes, that's a very good question. The thing is, I didn't have time to talk about this, but the main differentiation that all the discussion in the sanctions ethical literature makes is between the government and the population. And although it would be probably a bit tedious if I went into all the libraries full of discussion about this, there are libraries full of discussion on this. And the reason we have to use the ethical literature rather than the legal literature in terms of just war tradition is because the Geneva Conventions or an analogous framework don't apply to peacetime, which is why all the discussion on economic sanctions uses what's called the just war analogy. And it's very, very simple to use that and pretty logical, because here we want to talk about the difference between a government, which we don't support, and a population which suffers from its government, and then through the use of sanctions which are directed against the whole population, has a double whammy in terms of its effect. Now, what this, again, in summary, what this means is, though, that although the United Nations certainly has a responsibility in international law to think about peace and security, and certainly the North Korean government has the primary responsibility for the welfare of its citizens, this does not mean that other actors do not have responsibility to those same populations. In other words, because a government is killing its people, it doesn't mean to say that the UN can do that as well. You know, that, and that's the simple answer. But there is a ream of literature on this, and I'm quite happy to send it to whoever wants it.
Okay. And based on your current contacts and knowledge, do you have any observation to make about what effect COVID-19 is having in North Korea?
Again, I couldn't write about this because I don't have enough data. So I tried just to write about things that I have data on. But given what I know about the medical and health structure, that they've got a decent amount of knowledge, they've got lots of facilities, but they've got no inputs: disinfectant, soap, running water, hot water, electricity. They've got it's not as porous a border as it used to be between China and North Korea, but people still come and go across it. And COVID isn't under control anywhere in the world. And so it's not going to be under control in North Korea. I watch the news as much as anybody else does, and I see that the North Koreans are now trying to blame any COVID outbreak on this poor North Korean in South Korea swum over to North Korea.
Right.
And I think given what we all know about the state of North Korea's health system, it would be, and what we know about COVID, as much as we all know about COVID, is that it really is a hidden enemy. It's impossible for it to be confined to one border.
Okay, I think we just ask one more question because we do try to keep to time. You know, people tune in on the basis that it'll be a half-hour presentation. I don't want to go too much over. But this is such a good question, I'll finish with this one. So the question is, the opposite of sanctions would be incentives. So do you see a way ethically to provide North Korea with incentives to denuclearize in ways that wouldn't prop up a regime that's in violation of UN sanctions or in resolutions and mistreating its population?
I think Martin's right. If diplomacy was to go along in the normal manner, one would expect to see some give and take, and some of that would be in terms of providing support to the population. Now, given my experience in the food aid sector, I thought the UN got it about right. It wasn't always successful, but it tried to monitor, to report back, to be accountable. And that's why we have all this massive data that we do have on North Korea today. Whereas the South Korean approach at the time was to give unconditional food aid. And that meant the North Koreans could just reinstitute the old systems that they had. My own view is that there's a big place for the international financial institutions like the World Bank, because they insist on accountability and transparency. And okay, they're lumbering institutions, but insofar as one could say rebuild infrastructure, which would help jobs, which would insist on, for instance, all the international labour conventions to be enforced, and to be reports and accountability back to those international financial institutions, where you'd have executives which are composed of different countries to monitor them, where there would be people, technicians and engineers from different countries going in and reporting back on these basic technical issues. I think that would be a way to slowly, through negotiations, say, well, we'll have a World Bank project which will improve agriculture, for example, agricultural infrastructure in South Hwang Hue, which is the agricultural breadbasket of North Korea. We're going to do this through all the modalities that we use in every other country in the world. And we're going to come in with our own people, and we're going to work with you guys, and we're going to report back on everything that we do. And it seems to me that it's the principles of bringing transparency and accountability which help the North Korean population, not just in those particular projects, but in introducing different ways of working and allowing an expansion of the civil and personal decision-making space for individuals according to standards which are not about surveillance, which are not about control, which are not about the North Korean government telling them what to do. So it's not easy, and there are no automatic answers, but there are some paths in. Actually, we've been very, very unadventurous in terms of UN states, I think, in thinking of various ways in which we could intervene in North Korea positively.
Okay, I feel like we've just gotten started and we're already over time. So I apologize for not getting the questions to you that were really very good. With your permission, I'll send you the questions by email so you can see them. So, and we look forward to having you back at some point. But with the time we had, I think you got us all thinking. This is a terrific start to a conversation, the beginning of a thought process. This issue is not going to go away. We're going to be dealing with this in the next year or two or three. And so it's wonderful to have a chance to begin to think it through. So thank you very much, Hazel. Thank you, audience, for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you at a future KEI program.
Thank you. Thank you.